So today is one of our own, Dr. Pamela Rutherford, and you know her from behind the camera there and running all the AV stuff for this course this year. So I'll introduce her a little bit. Dr. Rutherford is an associate professor here. Oh, sure, I get a text right in front of it. Dr. Rutherford is an associate professor here in the Department of Biology at BU. She obtained her BSc from University of Toronto in mathematics and biology, and an MSc from University of Western Ontario, I guess just now called Western. So you're old enough that you were there when it was called, okay. On the impacts of acidification on freshwater clams. And she got her PhD from my alma mater as well, University of Victoria, on life history evolution of Northern Alligator Lizards. And funny story, we were grad students at the same time, didn't know each other, although her supervisor was on my committee.
Your wife was in my class.
Yeah, my wife was in one of her labs she taught, so, but we never came across each other.
So we were here.
Yeah. So Dr. Rutherford's conducted research on amphibians and reptiles in British Columbia, Ontario, and Manitoba. And she is currently the co-chair of the Amphibian and Reptile Specialist Committee of COSEWIC, of which she is going to talk about today. So Dr. Rutherford will give her talk, and then I will facilitate any questions, bring around the microphone for you guys afterwards. Okay, so Dr. Rutherford, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Chris. So most of you guys know a little bit about my world of COSEWIC, but today I was going to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit more and tell you a bit more about the details, because in my experience talking to people, most people don't actually really know how a species gets endangered. I mean, we know it gets endangered because we kill a lot of them, but like legally, I guess, is where. So what I wanted to do with today's talk is I'm going to step through. It's going to be a lot more of a process talk, but I'm going to try. Policy can get a little dull, so I'll try and spice it up a little bit. But I'm going to basically step you through the process that we go through to get from listing a species as endangered, but then also what happens after that. So it does start with assessment with COSEWIC, and then SARA, which is the Species at Risk Act, which is legislation, kicks in. Then recovery and planning to help manage and deal with species that have become endangered, and that's actually run by ECCC. So, sorry, lots of government acronyms. It's very joyful. So, Environment Canada and Climate Change, but they all just call themselves ECCC. And they are also responsible for implementation and planning and monitoring. So I'm going to step you through all of that. And then throughout, I'm going to touch upon a couple of case studies. One of them is polar bear, because they're cool and sexy. And honestly, I don't really know a ton about polar bear. So I was curious to look at how what's happened with it through the process. But as you'll see as I'll go through, in the later stages of the process, I couldn't use polar bear anymore. So I'm also going to draw upon a species that I know very well, which is a prairie skink. And I've been studying those since I arrived at Brandon University. So this figure here is a big, giant overview of the entire process. And this was prepared by ECCC. So just to give you a sense, so throughout this talk, I'll be doing assessment. Then I'm going to be telling you a bit about the listing process, recovery planning, and implementation and monitoring. So these are the 4 steps, and I'll kind of come back to this as I go through. And here are our beautiful species, polar bear. We do know that they are in trouble. We know there's, polar bear are not. Life is not looking good in the future. And this is the gorgeous prairie skink that I work on. So assessment. So this is the part of the process that I work directly in. So this is here. And the biggest thing that we do is basically kind of 3 elements. We deal with candidate listing, we deal with a prioritization process, and then we also do actual assessment. So this is the main website. Again, this is an umbrella under ECCC, but none of us, I'm not employed by ECCC. We work at a distance from ECCC, but we do have administrative support from them. So That's their website. So we have three main functions, basically. So the assessment function, which is, I would say, really our big one, which is just to figure out whether or not species are in trouble. And the second one then is we actually periodically review. It's actually where Sarah kicks in. There's some very clear legislation as to how that and when that review happens. And then, of course, we report those results of assessment. So everything does go out. It's a relatively transparent process. It goes out through Minister of Environment, Climate Change, and then out through Conservation Council and out to the Canadian public. So all of the information is available in theory. Of course, you've got to navigate government websites, so that might not make it as transparent. So the work of COSEWIC, so there is and literally we call it the big table. There's a big table where everybody gathers, and at that big table, there's a whole bunch of different representatives. There are jurisdictional representatives, so every province and territory sends a representative to the big table. There are representatives from different groups. So there's Parks Canada representatives, and there's Canadian Wildlife Service representatives, and there's DFO representatives. So it's a collection of people representing sort of all of the jurisdictions and stakeholders. And then, and this is where I come in, there are representatives from various taxonomic groups-ish. So there's 10, they're called SSCs, specialist subcommittees. So they cover most of the taxa. There's some pretty giant, significant gaps, like, some of the smaller things, but marine mammals, terrestrial mammals, we do freshwater fish, marine fish, there's mosses and lichens, vascular plants, arthropods, birds. Number 9 is me, so I am co-chair of Amphibians and Reptiles. And then there is also an Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge, and the acronym again is ATK, subcommittee. And then there's also representatives from that serve on all of the groups. So I'll touch upon that throughout the talk. One of the huge things that I've seen even in my relatively short time with COSEWIC is a lot better movement on integrating that traditional knowledge rather than all of the decisions just solely being made on Western science or sort of, that's the language that is used. So who's there? As I mentioned, there's jurisdictional reps, so provincial, territorial, federal agencies. There are folks at the table, so they might serve as a co-chair like I do, but come from non-government agencies. So folks from NatureServe or Nature Conservancy, they don't have official representatives. They just might be sitting in a role around the table. Lots of independent scientists. There are, of course, ATK, Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Specialists, and members of the academic community. So a number of the co-chairs are like me or, have jobs at university institutions. Not all of them. The co-chairs, it's a real mixed bag, to be honest. But this kind of list of 5 kind of represents. So here's a snap. This was our, the SSC we meet once a year. This was our most recent meeting, and it's, this is our SSC, and as you can possibly tell, our meetings, especially since COVID, have switched over to be a bit more hybrid. So we have a mix of folks that are online here and those of us that were in the room. And those meetings happen in different places around the country. This past year, we met in Ottawa. The big table, we meet twice a year. Every fall, we meet in Ottawa, and every spring, we meet somewhere else. So I just found out yesterday. Shout out to the East Coasters. I'm heading out to Moncton. Yeah, so it's fun. So the assessment process, it is very detailed. I'm going to try really hard to keep it high level. So we basically go through 3 steps. So first thing we do is we generate a candidate list. So basically, we shortlist all of the species that are in our group. As amphibian reptile people, we have the tremendous luxury of having a very short list of species. There's only about 150 amphibian and reptiles in Canada. The arthropod crew and the vascular plants and the mosses and lichens, everybody else. I think marine mammals is kind of like this, a pretty short list, but everybody else has a very long list. From that, we basically use all available knowledge to kind of figure out which species to the best of our knowledge, are in the biggest trouble. So they kind of burble to the top of the list for an assessment. And then once that is approved, there's a whole process that goes through that approval process. We would generate a status report. So that status report is you pull together everything you know from any possible source that you can possibly get everything. And then, of course, that is then reported through that next steps, and then that would eventually lead to them getting a legal designation potentially. So what data do we actually use? Well, this captures something. This is from a paper from Singer et al. 2023, and it was actually looking at whether traditional knowledge, they use the terminology indigenous knowledge, which would be, I think, a more appropriate terminology. We're still using ATK. Government change is slow. It'll take them quite some time to change that acronym. This is definitely representing more where we are heading and less where we maybe are. But what we're hoping to do is move forward with a lot more incorporation of indigenous knowledge, merging that with scientific knowledge or Western science. But we also use community knowledge as well. So 2 and 3 has been used a lot of, 1 needs a lot more work. So literally we talk to anybody and everybody. We do not restrict ourselves to peer review papers. We will take anything, like anybody. When I'm trying to gather information about local species, I will talk to ranchers, I'll talk to farmers, anybody, you know, they often have such greater knowledge of the landscapes that they live on. So we don't restrict us to, we don't have this really sort of pointy head academic, only peer reviewed papers will do. We're very, very inclusive. And I'm very excited to see this piece moving forward. It is moving slowly, but it's forward. So that's good to know. So as we go through that process, the status report gets generated. These suckers are big, often 60 to 100 pages. One of my jobs as a co-chair when coming up to prep for a big table meeting. So I've got a big table meeting in 2 months. So they've started piping out the reports to us. And then as a co-chair, I have to read the report. So I've to get ready for a big meeting, I'm usually reading usually about 10, sometimes more of these 100-page reports. Not just reading them, you have to provide detailed edits on them. So it's a lot of work to prepare these reports, and they go through very, very thorough review processes as part of it. So ultimately what comes out the end is like a very simple outcome-ish, maybe, is the species will get assigned a status. And it's one of these 6 things. So extirpated, that may be a term you're not familiar with. So most people are familiar with extinct. So extinct means gone from the planet, never to be seen again. Think dodo. Extirpated just means gone from Canada. Remember, this is a body that's just Canadian, means gone from Canada, but may live elsewhere. And so we have a good number of amphibian reptiles that are extirpated. We've taken them out. Stuff in the Okanagan hasn't fared too well with the don't drink the Okanagan wines. I know everybody's like, this is lovely, but actually they've killed a lot of amphibians and reptiles. So anyway, endangered, the other levels in this is order kind of sort of most concerned to least concerned, endangered, threatened, special concern, not at risk. And then there is a category called data deficient. And that's where you don't have enough information to make an assessment. In the early years of COSEWIC, lots of species got that because a lot of scientists were very much sort of like just wringing their hands and be like, oh, we just don't have enough data. We need more data. The problem is when species got assigned data deficient, they just went into a black hole and then never came out of it. There was no conservation actions, just nothing happened for them. So that is a box that we avoid like the plague. Again, the acronym is DD, so don't go to DD if you can. Yeah, so if we're concerned that we're lacking data on a species, what we try to do is get out front of that. We set up conversations with jurisdictions, and we try to get people to collect data on things. Because it's such a timeline for preparing a COSEWIC report, it's usually approximately a 4 to 5 year process. We can start those conversations, get data collected, and then it will be available. Another massive tool is iNat. So I'm going to give out a big shout out to iNaturalist. Get it on your phone. If you see something, take a picture. It literally 3 seconds out of your day, take a picture of it, upload it. it is turning out to be a massive boon of information because it does have AI features. So even if you have no idea what that cool butterfly was, INAT might be able to tell you what it is, which is cool. But then on top of that, you can say, oh, well, I saw this thing. And people like me can download that data and use it. So this is a huge tool. Now, the assessment and the criteria, and in fact, a lot of our processes exist within the framework of IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. So this is an international body. And so in the early days when they didn't have a lot of processes, there was a lot of parallel actions, sort of development of processes. These days, that parallel stuff continues, but we're working very, very closely together. And many of us, slash, I would say probably all of us, serve on IUCN committees. So I serve on an IUCN committee for skinks, believe it or not. There's a whole committee just for skinks. I only have one in Manitoba, but there's a lot of others around the world. So you know, we are constantly working on developing these processes, but they all are framed within the IUCN framework. So how do we actually figure out whether something is endangered? That's a much more complicated process that I'm necessarily going to fully get into today, but give you a bit of a glimpse. So this is a snapshot of part of a page that we would use. So how exactly does this work? So something would get a designation of endangered, and then it would be given, associated with that would be a set of criteria that tell us why it's endangered. What's the actual problem with that species? Those criteria are A, B, C, or D. So this is A, one little glimpse of part of A. Within A, then there's subcategories A1, A2. I'm just showing you A1 right now. Then within those subcategories, so you might say a species is endangered. Why is it endangered? Well, it meets criteria A1. And so there's A, B, C, and D. So we'd say it meets criteria A1, B, and D. The reason we go through all of this level of detail is that it provides hugely useful information down the line to say, well, what's the problem, particular problem with this species? Where do we need to target our efforts? So I appreciate this is a screen grab, so probably not visible at the back of the room, but A is to do with decline in total numbers of mature individuals. So we focus our attention on what's going on with the adults. A1, the very lengthy thing says, an observed, estimated, inferred, or suspected, and believe it or not, those things all mean different things, and you're like, what's the difference between inferred and suspected? And that's a very long conversation, but those are the things we have. Reduction in total number of mature individuals over the last 10 years or 3 generations, whichever is longer, where the causes of the reduction are clearly reversible and understood and ceased and based on any of the following. So there's a lot of heavy lifting that words do. You get a little more comfortable with the language, but it has taken me a long time. And I always have this page open when I'm reviewing reports and when I'm at the big table. And then the A, B, C, and D are, well, what are the things that cause the reduction? The main gist of it is there's been a reduction, or we think there's been a reduction over, we always look over 3 generations. The reason for that is that that's what matters to a species. We don't just say 10 years. 10 years to a whale is like snapshot in time. 10 years to a butterfly, well, that's insanity, right? So we always go 3 generations. So we're working on a report now for snapping turtles. You may or may not know, but they are very long-lived. We're working on a report for loggerhead turtles. Those turtles, whether they're freshwater or marine, they live a long time, a really long time. My co-chair actually studies turtles, so he always tries to remind the group around the table that if we bring a turtle report forward, Tom always says, we're talking turtle time here, people. It's turtle time, 3 generations. That's like 150, 200 years. What's going to happen in that time? And then people can think, oh, geez, it's probably going to be very terrible in 200 years. And so the things that we try and look at, so the A, B, C, and D are, have we seen a direct observation? If we actually have data, some sort of index of abundance. We use that a lot with my species. Has there been a decline in where they live or the quality of their habitat? So we use a lot of GIS tools to estimate things like that. Actual or potential levels of exploitation. So we do have some species that are harvested. for the pet trade. That's our most common one. And then finally, effective introduced taxa, hybridization, pathogens, pollutants, competitors, or parasites. Big mixed bag, but basically some sort of external forces. That'll kick in lots of times, especially if you've got an amphibian that's dealing with disease. And so sometimes it can be A, B, C, D, and E, and we just identify. And then there's the B, the C, and D, and E, and they all have different kind of components. But so, for example, for a species to be endangered, we'd have to have seen a reduction in their population over 70%. That meets the criteria for endangered. If the reduction is just a mere 50%, then they're threatened. And then beyond that, they would land in special concern. If we, say, well, it looks more like it's about 30% reduction, then we might say special concern. If there's no reduction, we'd be not at risk. It's all cool. It's great. So this thing is a huge part of our process. So what about the polar bear? Well, it turns, I was having fun preparing this talk. It turns out these have a very interesting and a very long history. So in 1986, they did an assessment of them and said they were not at risk. They looked at them again 5 years later, and they said special concern. And then 8 years later, special concern, another 3 years, special concern, another 6 years, special concern, another 10 years, special concern. And that's their current state of affairs. I alluded to this, but SARA requires species to be looked at least every 10 years. We'll notice here that, and I'll show you some timelines because Chris is probably twigging already that some of this predates our actual legislation. So I'll get to some of that. So the interesting thing is COSEWIC, actually, this process started before the actual legislation exists, which you can tell by the look in your face, you're like, why? So COSEWIC got started because scientists wanted to come up with a way. And in fact, I can say that the first co-chairs and the leads of COSEWIC at the time were amphibian and reptile guys. There was huge concern. There were some really prominent individuals, and they pushed really hard to move this process forward and start to document and hopefully try and do something about. So this is where polar bears currently are. So as I said, we give them a label, special concern. We give them letters. I haven't showed those here just to keep it a little bit more simple. And then this other thing we do is we put together a short paragraph that will be released to the general public. It's called Reasons for Designation. It is meant to be readable by the general public, and we work on these at the table. Groups of us work in them, and it's literally done on the fly. It makes for very long days. So the polar bear one's a little longer than a single paragraph, so I broke it over a couple of slides, and I wanted to highlight a few sections of it just so you get a sense of what's in these things. So we usually try to include some language about what the problem is. So reduction in the area and period of sea ice coverage due to climate warming in the Canadian Arctic. So this is, and we usually get that like right out front. What's the biggest problem for this species? What's its biggest threat? So when we will label them as the primary threat. So the big problem with polar bears, most people are aware, is sea ice is the problem. Population levels and trends are currently uncertain, so they don't have good numbers on polar bears. The time this was written, so this is 2018, but that identifying gaps can also be really helpful because that can trigger some more work. Here's the second paragraph. And this one, of course, polar bears are hugely important in Aboriginal communities. So the ATK indicates stable or increasing populations, and management union is a conservation language where there's some crossover with how COSEWIC does things and some not crossover. And then the final one, we try to always end these things with like, what's the future look like? So this species may become threatened. So any species that's sitting at special concern, what we try to identify is, okay, what's the issue with them and what's going to move them from special concern to threatened or endangered? May become threatened because the effects of sea ice loss on this species will be extensive and ongoing. And I would suggest, I'm not on these guys would be a terrestrial mammal. I'm not on that committee, but I'm guessing they're looking at polar bears because I think things aren't going super great for polar bears. So that's a sense of my world and the process that I'm in. The next stage is this listing, and this is where we engage and the legal process kicks in. So listing, recommendation, decision. So there is a minister's response. There's a recommendation to GIC, which is a government body. And then ultimately, possibly, the species is listed. It's in very small print, but there's a little get out of jail free card, but there is a little pipe down here. So not all species designated endangered by COSEWIC are actually listed. So it could be a species that's identified as endangered, but it has no legal protection, which I know, it's sort of a mind blower, but anyway. So the Species at Risk Act was actually established in 2003. So polar bear COSEWIC reports go way back. I wrote a COSEWIC report on my beloved Northern Alligator Lizard back when I was at UVic in 1999. So again, it predated Species at Risk legislation. So SARA requires the Ministry of ECCC provides an official response to the assessment. So the COSEWIC assessment lands with ECCC and does require, because of all of these things are identified in the act itself. Those the committee meetings, so actually anybody can go to a COSEWIC meeting, they're open to the public. And we have short little sessions that are closed, but they would have more to do with if we were making decisions like appointing a new chair of COSEWIC or something. It has sort of similar structures to kind of university structures. So, but the 99.9% of the meeting is open to the public. So species designated by COSEWIC might apply for legal protection, but there's no guarantee. It still has to go through this next process. And then, so the biggest difference is when we're putting together a COSEWIC report, we're gathering all the biological information. We are not taking into account political, social, or economic factors. People like Dr. Malcolm, where this is their whole world, know that that is massive, but they come into practice, into account, whether through the legal designation process. Personal opinion for me is maybe not a great thing, because sometimes political decisions could derail what have already been good biological decisions. But unfortunately, this is SARA and this is what we have. But that's when, yes, you know of a few. So the SARA Act only applies to wildlife species that have given that legal designation. So it doesn't matter whether we said they're endangered if they don't get that designation. So SARA, it's a legal process. It has very clear-ish, always muddier than you think, but so the way they break it out is a species could land on one of three schedules. It could land on Schedule 1. If it lands on Schedule 1, that's officially protected and it receives all of that protection afforded to it. I will say the big caveat and a huge problem, in my opinion, with SARA is it only protects species that live on federal land. Species on private lands, any other species are not protected. There's a lot of non-federal land in Canada. So that is a problem, not gonna lie. It only deals with species that are extirpated, endangered, threatened, or special concern. That makes sense. It's not going to deal with something that's not at risk. Once it lands on Schedule 1, then that's where protection and recovery get implemented. There are two other schedules, and so species could be designated endangered and land on Schedule 2 and 3. So these are species that they go through COSEWIC, the ministry looks at them, minister looks at them, they land on 2 and 3 because they took into account political, social, economic factors. They bench them. I kind of think of this as benching them. They throw them on Schedule 2 or 3. What's the difference between 2 or 3? 2 or 3 are extirpated, endangered, or threatened. 3 are special concern, so lower priority. But functionally, it works the same. What happens is if you land on 2 or 3, you can have the potential to come back through for reassessment. But you're not, if you land on 2 or 3, even if you're endangered, you have no protection at all. Potentially, they could be listed or not listed. So they could go through, they could look at them again, and they could still leave them on 2 and 3, and they never make it to 1. And even though we know they're in trouble, they're not going to get any protection. So what about the polar bear? Back to the polar bear. So as you can imagine, so 2003 is when SARA actually started. So basically everything before then doesn't really matter as part of the SARA conversation. I have left 2002 on there because it was when SARA was enacted, that was the most recent COSEWIC report. So that did the 2002 polar bear report piped into the SARA process. So what happened? So 2002, it had a designation of special concern. It landed on Schedule 3. Didn't go directly to 1. Could have gone to 1, did go to 3. Didn't. 2 years go by, still not on 1. Things, I would suggest all of this stuff occurs in turtle time. It's painfully slow when you're really concerned and want to save things. 2005, they kicked it back to COSEWIC for another look, and that's where we landed. So it sat there. 2005, it went back to COSEWIC. That was why, again, there was only 6 years between those reports. Normally it would be 10 plus, but I'm guessing, this is just a guess, that's why they put out another report in 2008. More data, more information, whatever they had, still special concern. What happened then? A lot of consultations. Again, remember, this is when we're engaging the social, political, and economic factors. By 2011, they finally landed it on Schedule 1. So a polar bear was assessed as special concern. It took a very long time before it actually was given any legal protection whatsoever. And that's where it sits. 2018, the process was a little bit quicker. So there was a report done in 2018. So that would be our 10-year gap, 2008, 2018. That would be a normal part of the process. Did, again, a 2-year to get it on Schedule 1 actually is pretty darn quick, not going to lie. But report came out in 2018 and landed on Schedule 1 right away. So that's a good sign. So currently polar bears are protected. Yay. Okay, so what are they doing with that information? So then we know they're concerned, we know there's a problem. What about recovery and planning? So that gets us to this next stage here, recovery and planning. Big box. It involves generating things like a recovery strategy, an action plan, a management plan, identifying something called critical habitat. I'll touch on a little bit of each of these. It also involves, this kind of peels off the top here, but it also involves connecting with stewardship and volunteer actions, getting the communities engaged. So we've done a lot of this work, for example, with prairie skink. So those things are all part of that recovery in planning. So recovery strategies. So as soon as something lands on Schedule 1, you have to make a recovery strategy ideally and an action plan, but action plans haven't been generated for everything. And I'll show you some stats. And so who does those? Well, it's a big team of people that basically anybody who knows anything about the species gets together and does these things. It's a big mix. So I've served on recovery teams, and basically we pull together everything. Obviously, we're drawing information from the COSEWIC report, but we're pulling together additional information because remember, at this point, we've hit Schedule 1 and we've got political, economic, social factors as well. So we're just gathering as much as we can. And so basically the idea is that we're trying to come up with, it's kind of in the name, a strategy to help recover this species to their terminology is down list. So polar bears special concern. How do we get it off the special concern list down to not at risk? Up list, which is, I'm sad to say, is probably where it's headed, would be if it's special concern landed on threatened or endangered. But ideally, recovery strategies are to help us downlist species. Action plans then kind of pick up from the recovery strategy. I think the move forward is maybe to integrate them more, maybe slightly less documents, but wouldn't want to be tromping on government's efficiency toes. But basically, it's just what are the things we have to do that they're probably so what's missing? What do we not know about this? So it might kick off some research, or it might kick off some community activities. So what are the gaps? What are the issues with this species? How do we fill those? And so basically, most of the time, what we're trying to do is get information on things like habitat, protection measures, and again, that's where socioeconomic stuff can come into play, and other stuff. So for example, just an example, with a lot of our turtles, one of the big things with them is there's times of the years where they cross the roads. Huge issue in Ontario. They kill thousands, hundreds of thousands of turtles a year get run over on roads. So it would be actions like, putting up signs to tell people to slow down. FYI, they don't work. They don't slow down. So other actions, literally now we're moving to more to things like literally just close roads, because apparently if you put up a sign to say, some people sadly will speed up and try and kill turtles, but you literally see like the track marks. But So those might be some of the things that would be put forward. So what happened with our polar bears? So they're on Schedule 1. Where are they at? Well, I went way back to sort of pull together all the recovery information. So way back, if you remember, they were first identified 1986, first looked at. So that people have been concerned about polar bears for a very long time. So in 1981, there was actually an international agreement. And so what I do want to draw your attention to as part of these and part of this is that it doesn't mean that harvest will be shut down. With many of these species, there's continued harvest by local people using traditional means. So there's language. So and this is where working with Indigenous groups is helpful. But again, it's all part of managing populations. They want to manage them because this is part of their food source. So they'd really prefer that we don't kill all those things. This international agreement involved 5 Arctic nations. So it's common with a lot of species, especially species that move around a lot more, birds, for example, but lots of marine mammals. They don't just get to the Canadian border and throw the brakes on, right? They live all over the place. Their summer grounds might be in Canada, their winter grounds might be in Florida. So you do have to work internationally with groups to help protect, because depending on their sort of lifestyle, they might be more vulnerable, for example, on their winter grounds down in Florida. So there was an international agreement put together in 1981 with these guys. So if you remember 2008, there's still special concern. That's the first time they finally landed on Schedule 1 by 2011. 2009, there was a national roundtable. It was actually in Winnipeg, so yay us. Huge group came together. Again, a lot of this stuff is collaborative. It's slow processes. It involves meeting. It involves conversations. It moves slowly, but it does move forward. So 2009, there was a roundtable. Well, what about recovery strategies? Well, there actually still is no recovery strategy for polar bear. The best I could find from the website, and this is all that's available because anything on the website is everything they have, this is their update. So Indigenous consultation on a draft management plan began in October 2022 and will continue into October 2023. Once Indigenous consultation is complete, the management plan will be finished. Now we're already 2024 and we're still not seeing a recovery strategy or a management plan, which is also kind of comparable language to action plan. So this is a species that's in trouble. We know it's not getting better for them, and there's still not great protections or strategies moving forward. So this was kind of the end of the line for polar bear. So basically none of this stuff exists for these guys. We haven't done anything. I don't know, and I don't have the information, but I expect there's lots of work that's been done on the stewardship side, but I'll leave it at that. What I will, this is where my second species will kick in, is I'll kick in and tell you a little bit more about prairie skink, because we've actually done a lot more of these documents for that. So I mentioned that one of these things we do as part of it is to identify something called critical habitat. And it is exactly kind of like what you intuitively think it is. It's habitat that is critical, it's in the title, for survival and recovery, right? So for, things like snakes, a hibernation site, right? The narcisse snakes, those red-sated guider snakes, that hibernation snakes the site goes north of Winnipeg, they're toast, they're gone. So it may be features on a landscape, so it doesn't necessarily mean a dot on a map. It might be a dot on a map with a caveat of within that, these features on a landscape, but all of that really gets fed into these this recovery strategy and action plan, and we detail like what are the things that are important for the biology of that species. So they get identified in either a recovery strategy or an action plan. Ideally, both exists, and then there's a huge lengthy review of that. It goes out to jurisdictions, it goes out to stakeholders, goes out through a public consultation process, and sadly, there could be a dot on a map that says this wetland is needed. This has happened. This wetland is needed for this particular species in Ottawa. And somebody who has way more power than I do says, nope, I was going to put a shopping mall there. And so guess what happened to the wetland? Yeah, shopping mall. So again, our process has got problems, but hopefully we can try at our best. There's been a lot of public action to try and save some of that. So the idea is that that process of identifying habitat is consistent. It has taken a long time to reach that. It's documented and it's transparent. That has been painful, and I lived the dream. So this is where I'll kick over. So this is my beloved prairie skink. So this is the map from the recovery strategy of where these guys live. So we are we off the map? Yeah, I don't think Brandon's actually, oh, excuse me, it's right there. So Brandon is right there. That is us. So this big area here and this dashed line area here is where the range, the Canadian range of prairie skinks, they only live in Manitoba, the only place you find them in the country. And huge amount of work from me, from my graduate students, undergraduate students went into that dashed line on the map. So that exists in the report. And then within that, huge amount of work. We worked on this probably for close to 10 years because we started this when none of the kind of processes were in place. We didn't know. Nobody knew how to designate critical habitat. It was just, we were flying blind. So I started working on prairie skink in 2005. Sarah just opened in 2003. People didn't have a process. It was wild, to be honest. And sadly, most of the work that was done on this got triggered because NGOs and other bodies started launching lawsuits, and the government had to actually do what the act said that they were bound to. But it was messy, but we got through there. So this thing was finally finished last year. I started on this thing in 2005, and I think, yeah, we finished it either last year or the year before. So 17 years of my life into this sucker. So these little squares, these are the phrasing that we use is within which critical habitat may be found. So the whole square is not critical habitat, but there are features within that square that are important for skinks. They might be hibernation sites. They might be places where we found nests. So I'm not going to lie, most of these squares, and the reason these squares on the map is from data from my lab. So that this is the process that we go through. So if somebody wants to do something in this square that will destroy the habitat in this square, Sarah prevents them from doing that because of this adorable, look at the face, creature. So that is the process. It is moving forward a lot better now. They're making really good strides, but they have a long way to go. So this is the current state of affairs as listed on the COSEWIC website yesterday. So how many status reports have been prepared? 950, but bear in mind that it will include multiple reports per species, but that's the total that have been prepared. How many recovery strategies have been prepared? Only 385. Now, not all of these might have required a recovery strategy. You only get a recovery strategy if you're extirpated, endangered, threatened, or special concern. So if you get designated not at risk, no recovery strategy. That's where it stops. How many action plans? Well, there's a big gap. So we're way behind. ECCC, not my job. How many critical habitat descriptions are in the Gazette? That's the kind of official government place where you would go to find out where critical habitat is, 129. That number is below 385. So there's a lot of work to be done to get caught up. They're working hard. We meet with these guys regularly, but yeah, there's a long way to go. So what happens after that? Well, that's this final stage, implementation and monitoring. So again, I'll stick with the prairie skink because polar bears toast. Well, they're not all, but it ended because there's no recovery strategy. So this is the management plan for prairie skinks. That's the front picture. I clipped a little bit about the action plan. So what we're basically trying to do is maintain their current distribution and then also maintain any new populations. And this is a little clip just to give you a sense of some of the activities that we might be undergoing, and then they rank them priorities. So for example, top one, assess threats at all current and previously occupied sites. That's ranked a medium priority. A high priority, for example, is participate in conservation efforts to halt loss of grassland habitat, high priority. So that would be preventing things like more turnover of grassland into crops. So groups like Nature Conservancy have been massively active in that area. This is not an exhaustive list. It goes on a lot more than that. So, but these are the kinds of things that are ongoing with prairie skinks. Their current listing actually is special concern. They were listed as endangered. That kicked off a lot of research. And then when we assessed them again, they were assessed at special concern. It does make it look like they're doing much better than they were because they dropped 2 categories, right? They win. A huge part of that, which was a really good outcome, is we found out there were a lot more in the landscape than we realized, which is great and good, but they have stayed at special concern because we're still fairly concerned. Grassland habitat is one of the most threatened habitats in the world, and we have very little of it left in Manitoba. So they, by just default, anything that lives in grassland habitat is going to be of concern unless there are some significant shifts. And of course, we've got, well, we're not going to take all of the agricultural land and turn it back to grassland because we need food for people. So this is very complicated, but that's my overview. So hopefully you learn a little bit about COSEWIC, smidge about Sarah. I guess I guess it just turned 20. So happy birthday, Sarah. A little bit about recovery planning, which is ECCC, and implementation and monitoring. And I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah, so thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rutherford. I'll let you stay in the camera. I won't come up and body check you out of the way. Oh, so many questions. This is right up my alley. So I have so many questions, but I'm gonna let the audience ask questions first. So yeah, just hold it up close.
Is it on blue?
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That was cool. I've made up your research project to explain science to my girls, but I didn't know anything about it until today.
Cool.
I've told them that you put things in the field to look at lizards, right? And
lizards.
they think that's so great.
I'm
actually really curious about, you said you found more on the landscape than you had thought there was. And that really infers this idea of like species density spatially compared to some prior expectation. And so you can look at that, like that trend. This is one piece of your assessments, but it's the piece that I like the data models. So how do you look at that kind of trend line and kind of bring all that data together to say this density is changing in a significant way and we didn't know what it was before?
That's a brilliant question. So a couple of pieces. You may be horrified to know, but literally whether something lands endangered, threatened, or special concerns come down to one number. Are there more than 10,000 or less than 10,000? It gets very simplified-ish. Obviously, we try to do as much as we can with the information that we have. So there are some of the SSAs, the ones that have the most data are the bird folks, because they have a long history of things like breeding bird counts. They are swimming in data. And the other group that's just swimming in data are the freshwater fish guys. So those guys have done, and actually the marine mammal guys have decent data for some whales. Sorry, I keep pointing at Chris because in a former life he was a whale guy, and I think you're still a whale guy at heart. So there is an option. It's actually the criteria E that I showed you guys. The E one is if you do all sorts of quantitative analyses. So some groups do extremely detailed quantitative analyses. They do projections to the future and all this kind of stuff. I haven't yet met an amphibian and reptile we have that data for. So we do, Tom and I do a lot of this. And because we just don't have data. But ideally, we would do exactly what you're suggesting, and that's what folks that have data, the arthropods people, they think we have a lot of data. So it's always, there's always this data jealousy. But ideally, you would do a very detailed quantitative analysis and then do those protection. The tools exist for it. Our limitation is frequently the data. What we're using these days for amphibian and reptiles is a lot of inference because there's a lot of spatial data, right? And I'm not a geographer, but I am at heart. And I have pushed really hard, and we have some really good people on our SSC committee that have GIS skills. So then we can do some projections based on habitat loss using exactly as you framed density estimates, and then we can do some, probably again math that would horrify you, but we can use some sort of metrics. Yeah. So yeah, very long answer, but very, very full question. Yeah.
Just sorry, the technical question where field work is such a limitation is only a piece of it, which actually
Only a piece.
is a
Yep.
great
Yep.
the strategy.
Yeah, it is for sure. Yeah.
I think Akwasi had a question.
I need to press.
Just put it up close to you.
Okay, so thank you very much. At least we've been introduced to COSEWIC in your class, and then we're working on it. But I'm a bit interested in the SARA listing and then the COSEWIC assessment conflict. Is there currently a strategy to address that? Because I find it concerning when probably you do the assessment, and unfortunately the legal framework doesn't cover the species, and then there'll be back and forth here and there. So is there a deliberate strategy?
What was your last phrase? Is it a
Deliberate strategy.
Yeah, so actually, and I maybe didn't frame it very well, it actually is considered a feature, not a bug. So when COSEWIC and SARA were put in place, a lot of scientists, myself included, I don't know if Dr. Malcolm signed petitions, but we pushed really, really hard that the body that was assessing the status and looking at the biology would be independent. And so we would not be influenced politically. We would not be government employees. We would be an independent body. And so we can work and do our work outside of any of those pressures. It is very reasonable. You have to look at the whole picture. So they did it by design, which is to say there'll be an assessment, independent assessment done. And then we still have to look at political, social, and economic. And so that's when they built that into the SARA process. It's not to say there's not flaws, but it actually was by design. I think there is some good in that. It does mean we can. Nobody is lobbying me, we just do our work and make our assessment, but it can end up not being listed where that political, social, economic sometimes can come into play, and sometimes not in a positive way. But I do agree, and I, in general, do think that it was it's a pretty decent system, especially if you learn a little bit more about other systems around the world. I would say ours is pretty solid. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but yeah.
So along that line, maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about why would a species like lake sturgeon that's been assessed, what kind of reasons are the socioeconomic and sociopolitical causing it to end up on schedule 2 or 3 and not schedule 1?
Well, frankly, you probably know better than me, Chris, I'll be honest, because I sit on COSEWIC, we do very intentionally stay in our bubble. And if somebody around that table starts raising social, political, economic factors, they get shut down. They just say, nope, that's not part of our decision. So do you know the sturgeon story? Because I don't. And I don't know the polar bear story.
As far as I know, the sturgeon story is critical habitat, is spawning grounds in, say, the Assiniboine River. And if you want to do anything in the Assiniboine River, put in a weir, put in a dock, any of that has to go through all the work and could essentially be negated, that you can't do that because it's critical habitat. So they haven't wanted to make that step. At least that's the way I understand it.
No, I think that is
because it would curtail human development.
Thank you so much. I think mine is to thank you for the wonderful report, so to speak, on COSEWIC. And I would have said the danger of a single story, but you have just mentioned some other agencies the COSEWIC partner with like the IUCN, like this university, like experts and all that. So that is outside of it. Because if I'm talking about someone without the person's input, whatever I say about the person is a fallacy and null and void. Though having said that, I would ask, how can the public, because I like nature, but when you were presenting those animals, I just like them. So how can public maybe get involved in supporting COSEWIC in its, work, to assess and protect wildlife? Like
Yeah,
myself, like,
I mentioned, and I'll just reiterate, the hugest, most useful thing we can get from public engagement is just records. People on the landscape that see things, and it's so great these days. Cell phone, snap a picture, upload it. So, for example, a species that I'm dribbling my way through now is a poor Collins. So my conservation biology class, of which the grad students are in, have been they are engaged in the COSEWIC project, and they're actually doing climate change modeling, which I didn't even mention to you guys, but that is becoming a much bigger piece and much more quantitative. So Collins got tasked with the eastern tiger salamander, which lives in a very small region within Manitoba. They're a big salamander, like as salamanders go, they're a big-ish one. They're no Pacific giant, Chris, but they're a solid salamander. But they're a salamander. They live underground. They are not out most of the time. We have so little data on them, like a handful of records. So, but there are times of the year where big numbers might cross the road. And so that's a huge engagement with the public. More locally, we've done a lot of work with landowners, local landowners with the prairie skink, because it's not a problem, for example, if cattle graze in areas where skinks are, unless they overgraze, right? So those are some of the kinds of things with public. People in Ontario, I have a lot of colleagues in Ontario, they live in a very different world. It's just pavement and roads and cars, so their public engagement looks different. Out here, it tends to be more ranchers and stuff. But if you're out hiking, load iNaturalist on your phone, snap a picture, upload it. It's not a huge deal. You can have a competition with your friends who has the most number of iNats. You can really go to town on it, and it is massively helpful. It's a data source that is just changing the game. I'm not going to lie. Yeah. So am I over? I have
We
lost
should
track.
probably wrap up a little, but
Yeah,
I have
sure.
to mention one thing is that landowners aren't always interested in helping. When we were doing yellow rail work back 20 years ago in Douglas Marsh, when I was first here, the road bisects Douglas Marsh that goes down through Douglas and down towards Shiloh. And on one side, there's an area where landowners will let people go on land, birders go, and we were doing work there, but we could hear them on the other side of the road. But the private landowners would not let us go on their land. They don't want someone to know that they have a threatened species on their land, right? So all we could do was listen to them. So not all landowners want to help, but I think it's becoming more and more that they do.
It is a mixed bag for sure. And Chris's data on yellow rails, actually in December, we reassessed yellow rails. And that was a report I read in detail, and they stayed special concern, but your work featured in that, which was nice.
Thank you.